Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel. On this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And we have interesting updates both from the territory of Ukraine and from the Iranian-Israeli conflict. But first let's talk about the special military operation zone where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And yesterday we got a very interesting statement that was made by the Ukraine foreign minister. Ukraine is not interested in continuing negotiations unless they include a substantive discussion on a ceasefire. He stated that during the negotiations the Russian delegation actually demanded Ukraine's capitulation. He also claims that Russia has begun preparing strategic reserves. So the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are begun preparation for autumn offensive operation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northeastern part of Ukraine. And today we got another picture where we can see approximate roads of Russian attacks in the northeastern part of Ukraine. As we discussed, the Russians are pretty focused in this area, and since the beginning of June the Russians destroyed lots of vehicles, equipment and military positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. We've discussed every single video in this area. For example, once again on the 13th of June we got this video where the Russians managed to discover Ukrainian equipment and they destroyed this area with the Giran strike. Another video took place almost in the same area. This time the Russians managed to discover equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine that most likely Ukrainians were using to support their drones while attacking deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation, or maybe the Ukrainians were using this area as a warfare equipment with the purpose to intercept Russian drones. Anyway, the Russians destroyed this territory as well. Furthermore, during the June of 2025 we got lots of videos how the Russians were attacking Ukrainian FPV drone positions. So as we understand, since the beginning of the special military operation, when the Russians abandoned their positions in this area, the Ukrainians managed to reinforce their positions in this direction with the purpose to control the territory of the Russian Federation as deep as possible. And now the task is very simple for the Russians: to destroy as many as possible equipments of the armed forces of Ukraine, and then most likely to continue their offensive operation in this direction as well, with the purpose to cut this northeastern pocket. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sumy area where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. And during the previous 24 hours, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. Just yesterday, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the settlement of Yablunovka was completely secured by the Russians and taken under complete Russian control. And today we got additional reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions even further in the southern direction. And for example, today the village of Varachino was completely secured by the Russians, as you can see. Furthermore, the Russians managed to take under control several strongholds and positions of the armed forces of Ukraine along N07 road between the settlements of Yunakiivka and the settlements of Kianitsa. So these three lines were taken according to several neutral mappers. So now we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the central offensive area in the direction of the city of Sumy, and then the Russians will have just the eastern direction where the Ukrainians still show fierce resistance. During the previous 24 hours we got additional videos how Russians were attacking Ukrainians there, but we see that, for example, this episode took place almost in the central part of the village, which means that Ukrainians still control the territory and the Ukrainians are not going to give up. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, we got a proof that confirms Russian control over Yablunovka. Once again, I'll remind you, yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed this information, and a few hours later, the Russians also published this video where we can see almost destroyed building and Russian flag above it. So we see that the Russians finished the battle for the first defense layer for around 80%. They have just one settlement left. We're talking about the village of Yunakiivka, and after the fall of Yunakiivka we can say that the battle for the first defense layer finished, and then the Russians most likely would continue further in the southern direction with the purpose to take under control the next defense layer. But obviously we see that the Russians' offensive is getting slower and slower. Very difficult to understand why exactly is this happening, but at the same time the Ukrainians are saying that the situation is very critical. Most likely during the previous days the Ukrainians managed to introduce additional forces, and that is why the Russians were forced to slow down. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. Unexpectedly, the Russians resumed their attempts to attack in the most eastern part of this Kupiansk pocket. I'll remind you that since the beginning of June, the Russians were pretty focused on Ukrainian logistics in this area, trying to destroy as many as possible supply roads between the left and the right banks of the river of Oskol. In this video, we can see how the Russians destroyed one of the pontoon bridges in this area. Furthermore, during the same period of time, during the previous 2 weeks, the Russians destroyed another pontoon bridge and river crossing in this area. So the Russians were pretty focused, and obviously all these attacks means just one thing, that the Russians were planning to begin offensive operation on the Russian side of the river Oskol. It was just a question how exactly the Russians were going to attack, from the northern direction in the direction of the northeastern part of Kupiansk, from the southern direction in the direction of the settlements of Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, or from the most eastern part of this pocket. And the Russians chose the eastern direction because, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians took under control several positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the fields in the vicinity of the settlement of Nova Stepova Novoselka. This information was confirmed by neutral and pro-Russian resources. Pro-Ukrainian mappers haven't confirmed this information yet, but we expect that sooner or later they will be forced to do this. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 13th of June, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 14th of June. The Russians currently are trying to cut this pocket and to get as close as possible to the city of Kupiansk itself. This will allow the Russians to bring and to get closer their artillery systems from the east, and this will allow them to attack Ukrainian positions along the city, along the Kupiansk entire agglomeration and behind this agglomeration itself. As for now, the Russians have problems with their artillery systems because they are forced to keep their artillery systems too far from the main area of clashes and offensive operation. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Constantinovka direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions. First, let's talk about the southeastern part along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians established control over several company strongholds in the vicinity of the settlements, between the settlements of the north and the south and the Liivka. These 2 strongholds, as you can see, were taken by the Russians. At least this information was confirmed by several pro-neutral mappers. So these 2 strongholds were taken, and now we understand that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the south and the Liivka itself. Several days ago, we got reports that the Russians secured the railway station area, and there's just several tree lines and buildings left for the armed force of the Russian Federation. But due to the fact that the Russians secured these 2 strongholds, we expect that in the very near future, everything in this area would be colored in the Russian favor. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians continue clearing the pocket along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. At least this information was confirmed by neutral mappers. So we expect that this pocket would be cut by the Russians also in the very near future. And then the Russians will start battle for the northern part of the northern Liivka and for the village of Bilogora itself, which will allow the Russians to maintain their positions and to shorten the lines between the city of Toretsk, the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and the southern part of the city of Chasov Yar. And this is going to be the end of the preparations before the beginning of major offensive operation in the Konstantinovka direction, at least from the southeastern and from the eastern positions. When talking about the Kliban-Byksky pocket, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions according to several mappers. As you can see now, the Russians are advancing in the fields. Just yesterday, several mappers reported that the Russians improved their positions to the north of the settlement of Romanovka, and today we got additional reports that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the road of 524, the main logistic road of the armed forces of Ukraine. So as you can see now, the Russians, the distance between edge positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the road of 524 itself is around 1 kilometer and 550 meters, which is already nothing for probably vehicle attacks, for tank attacks, for FPV drone control. So we see that the Russians are about to finish the creation of a cauldron for the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of these settlements. We are talking about Novospaska, Shcherbinovka, Katerinovka, and Kiban Big. The Russians established certain control over the western supply lines, and the Russians established control over the northeastern supply lines. Furthermore, when talking about the northeastern direction, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians secured this elevation, strategic elevation in this area, and now the Russians can control the entire Kiban water reservoir without any problems. At the same time, we see that the Russians stopped their offensive operation in the area of Yablunovka. I would like to remind you that during the previous week, the Russians were advancing in this area, taking one position after another, and somewhere by the beginning of this week, the Russians managed to secure the western part of the settlement of Yablunovka completely. And since that moment, we haven't received anything. We discussed that most likely the Russians answered the central part, but we still haven't received anything that can confirm this. Most likely the Ukrainians have strong control over the central part of Yablunovka, and the Ukrainians managed to introduce additional forces in this area with the purpose to stabilize the situation, because the Ukrainians understand that the situation for the Ukrainians in this pocket is critical, and if the Russians are able to improve their positions for another several kilometers, this can lead to complete collapse and to cauldron of several thousands of Ukrainians in this area. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction or the Dnipropetrovsk direction. According to information we have, the Russians improved their position significantly, and currently the main activities are taking place between the settlements of Kamar and Zaporozhye. I would like to remind you that just yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed Russian complete control over the village of Kamar, and the Russians provided this video where we can see how exactly the clashes and the battle for the village have been taking place. In this video we can see lots of episodes, and in the most final part of this video we could see how Russians were raising their flags in different parts of the village. And based on this report and based on this video and the Minister of Defense report, we adjusted these territories. And today we got additional changes on the ground, because according to several mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields. Basically, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense in this area to secure the village of Zelyony Kot in the pocket of Novoukrainka, and to shorten the distance to the village by the name of Zaporozhye. Furthermore, as we discussed, the Russians control this territory with FPV drones. We have lots of videos, and during the previous days we discussed that the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory with all calibers they have, including artillery strikes and aviation strikes. So due to this pressure, we expect that the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their lines for a very long period of time, and we expect that the villages of Zirka, Yalta and Zaporozhye would be taken by the Russians in the very near future, and this can happen even by the end of the Monday or Tuesday of the next week. So very soon the Russians are advancing very soon in this area, and obviously the Ukrainians have poor situation with their logistic in this area. And if the Russians are able to secure this territory and to get the village of Yalta, this opens the Russians the window of opportunities to attack the settlement of Novopoltavka from the south and from the southwest. At the same time, we remember that the Russians currently are advancing in the northeastern direction to the village of Novopoltavka. So the situation remains tense for the Ukrainians, and several units of the armed forces of Ukraine are at risk of being encircled by the Russians. When talking about the Zaporozhye direction, today we got first proofs that the Russians most likely managed to answer the settlement of Malinovka. This video was confirmed and provided by pro-Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainian drone was flying above this territory, and according to the author of this video, the Ukrainian drone was filming Russian positions in this area. Based on this video, most of the mappers suggested their maps in the southeastern part of the settlement. Furthermore, the Russians continue improving their positions around the village of Malinovka by taking under control additional true lines. Situation for Ukrainians in this direction also remains tense. When talking about Ukraine, we've covered almost every single report about the situation. Now let's talk about the Iranian-Israeli conflict. As if you remember, yesterday Israel began their own special operation with the purpose to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities and nuclear objects, with the purpose not to allow Iran to get nuclear weapon. And as a result of first days of attack, or first hours of attack, Israel managed to achieve significant results. Israel managed to destroy almost completely Iranian air defense systems. Israel managed to destroy lots of launching system, energy facilities that were supplying nuclear facilities on the territory of Iran. Israel managed to use lots of aircrafts, where lots of explosions, lots of strikes, and the most important is that as a result of this Israeli attack, the Ukrainians lost almost the entire top military authorities. In 12 hours, Israel killed almost the entire top military command of Iran. The persons are still gathering their forces for response, if there is one at all, of course. So during the previous 24 hours, during the previous day, while Israel were attacking Iran, everybody was waiting for the retaliatory strike from the Iranian side, but telling the truth, by the end of the 13th of 2025, I start issuing some doubts whether the Iranians are able to counterattack Israel. And somewhere at around 8, 9, 10 p.m. of local time, Iran launched their massive missiles, a significant number of missiles in the direction of Israel. I believe all of you saw those videos of strikes on the territory of Tel Aviv. There were lots of explosions, lots of buildings were damaged, several air defense systems were damaged. According to information we have, the Iranians managed to damage the Ministry of Defense of Israel, and there were 4 waves of attacks. Iran used lots of hypersonic missiles, and there were more than several hundreds of those missiles. And by the morning of the 2025, Iran finished their retaliatory strikes, and we start receiving statements from the Prime Minister of Israel regarding the situation and red lines that were crossed by Iran. And most likely today or the day after, Israel will continue their special operation. I would like to remind you that Israeli Prime Minister stated that there are at least 4 steps of this special operation, 14 days of possible bombings. So most likely today we're going to see another round of escalation. But obviously, the first round of escalation brought us to unpredictable consequences. For example, now we see who chose which side. We understand that the United States of America for 100% stands behind Israel. France supported Israel. But today we also got very interesting and unexpected statements from, for example, the Russian Federation. Today, the president of the Russian Federation stated he had a call, first of all, conversation with Iranian president and Israeli prime minister. And according to this short article, Russia supported Iran, and Russia probably condemns Israeli actions. That was stated at least by official press release of the Russian Federation. And the most important is that China also supported Iran, and according to information we have, China sent messages to the Western partners like the United States of America, France, probably other countries, that nobody can join this war between Iran and Israel, because if anybody decides to answer this conflict on the territory of Israel, then most likely Iran will have the right to destroy every single base, most likely maybe of the United States of America or the United Kingdom in this area. So nobody is going to be involved in this conflict, and most likely Israel and Iran are going to stay face to face, and let's see what is going to be next. Once again, we are waiting for another round of escalation, and for example, during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of reports that Iran is preparing to launch their first nuke test, which is very interesting. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.